Hi, and welcome back to this series on recovery from childhood sexual abuse with a focus on abuse occurring within the family of origin. I'm Rebecca Coffey, and I'm thrilled to be here today with two amazing human beings, Deborah Becky and James Ikeda. And the focus of this video today is really twofold. The first is to talk about what does it look like and what does it mean to be an advocate for survivors while you are a survivor. And the second part is the need to bring awareness for the need for more survivors to live their status as a survivor openly so that they can be seen, so that we can make this very large section of our population visible. So that will be our focus. But before we begin, I always like to do a centering and grounding so that the speakers can really speak in integrity and from their heart, and that the listeners, my viewers, can really take in this information. So the lovely Deborah Becky is going to do a little grounding for us and set our intentions.
Thank you, Rebecca. First, let me say thank you for doing this wonderful, courageous thing. I invite you to find a comfortable seat, wherever that may be, feet on the floor, grounded. Let your arms just be where they feel comfortable. Lengthen your spine, let it grow tall. Root into your sitting bones. Feel the stability. If you like, close your eyes. If that doesn't feel comfortable, just have a soft gaze somewhere on the floor beyond you. Now bring your awareness to the breath. Without changing it, just notice. Just notice the inhalation, the exhalation, the in, the out, the wave of breath that comes and goes. If it feels comfortable for you, you can bring a hand to the belly and notice how the belly rises up and down as you breathe. Let's begin to deepen the breath. Breathe in through your nostrils. Allow the belly to expand. And then with another sip of air, draw the breath up into your rib cage, expanding it front and back and sides. And finally, invite the breath up into the heart space, opening the heart, allowing it to be open to give, to receive. Pause for a moment and exhale. Allow the breath to find its way back to the belly. And at the end of the exhalation, a little squeeze of the belly to expel any stale air or anything that doesn't serve you in this moment. And now allow your breath to return to its natural rhythm. And if you will, listen to the words of Swami Kripalu. My beloved child, break your heart no longer. Every time you judge yourself, you break your own heart. You stop feeding on the love which is the wellspring of your vitality. The time has come, your time, to live, to celebrate, and to see the goodness that you are. You, my child, are divine. You are pure. You are sublimely free. You are God in disguise, and you are always perfectly safe. Do not fight the dark. Just turn on the light and breathe into the goodness that you are.
Thank you, Deborah. I love that line. Do not fight the dark, just turn on the light.
Turn on the light.
And I believe that, we have to focus on all the good. And so, in this series, I was just talking with Deborah and James before we started. And one thing that I want to communicate to all survivors is the journey of recovery from childhood sexual abuse can feel very alone. But as I look back on my years of recovery, I see that I wasn't alone, that I had so much support and so much love around me. And if you've been following this series for a while, you know that in each segment, I share a little bit of my own story. So the story that I'm going to tell today is when I finally, this was 7 years ago, came out of the closet as an incest survivor. Even though I had been a therapist and a dance therapist and was helping people one-on-one, and I led retreats and small groups where I would share my story, I really wanted to just live my life openly with my status. I knew it was really important when I was young to see other people in my community, leaders, teachers, who had lived through what I'd lived through. You know, I didn't need to know their whole story. I just needed to know they were the same as me. And so as I became an adult, I knew that that's what I wanted to be for others. It felt like a life calling for me. And so, 7 years ago, I came out publicly through writing an article and having that published. And then a few months later, I stepped out and started speaking as an advocate. And my life completely changed and my life became better. And I realized that all the years that I had lived, not telling people, not letting people know that this was a part of me, because it's such a big part of me, it actually slowed my healing. It slowed my progress. And so why I'm doing this particular video is to encourage survivors to, you know, if you don't see examples, maybe, think about one day being an example yourself. Sometimes we need to write the script of the way we need to heal, and we can do that. So 7 years ago, I was working at a high school. I was an English teacher at a high school in Massachusetts. And James here worked across the hall from me as a history teacher. And Deborah was the school psychologist. And so let me introduce them before I start to tell a little bit of my story. So Ikeda, his bio here, is a public school teacher, a poetry coach, a community college professor, a PhD student, a touring musician, and community organizer. He has been teaching for 11 years and teaches a wide range of subjects, including U.S. history, philosophy, and political street performance. He also designed and teaches courses in African American and Asian American history. James co-runs a Boston-based community arts and civic education group and has facilitated organizing trainings for youth activists at Revere Youth in Action, Green Roots in Chelsea, Zoomix in East Boston, and a local Boy Scout troop in Quincy. So, yay, James Ikeda, powerhouse right here, let me tell you. And then we have the lovely Deborah Becky. Deborah Becky completed her 200-hour teacher training at the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health in 2016, the same year I stepped into my advocacy, after returning from a 30-year career as a public school psychologist. And just take that in. A longtime advocate for marginalized communities, Deborah was instrumental in developing and leading school-based programs on the trauma-sensitive classroom, supporting LGBTQ+ students and staff, and teen dating violence. She has led free yoga classes for children and adults at the Boston Children's Hospital, and through her affiliation with the nonprofit Hands to Heart Center, she provides yoga and mindfulness classes in schools, shelters, and senior housing throughout Boston. So, yes. And so I do want to mention too that both Deborah and James collaborated in the school for many years and were a safe haven for kids, where kids could feel heard, where they could feel that they had someone in their corner. And that is another reason why I really wanted them to be here today. So, back to my story. So, even though I was working to help survivors, I really wanted to write and publish some work on what it was like to be a survivor. I wanted to start speaking, but for years I was held back from doing that because I had this belief that if I did this, I would get fired from my job, my main job, which was being a high school teacher at the time. So I thought, I can't do both. I can't be a teacher and then have on my website that I'm going to go somewhere Saturday and have a public speaking, or I'm going to write this. And what if parents find this out? And what if kids find this out? I'm definitely going to get fired. And so at the time, James was someone in my school community. I would watch him get up and speak at staff development so courageously about topics that were really hard. And I really admired him. And so I remember sitting with him one day and just telling him about this dream that I had. I said, I really want to be a public advocate. And James looked at me and he said, you know, you can do both. You know, you have every right to be a high school English teacher and also a public advocate for survivors. And so what James did was he educated me on my rights, and that helped to dispel the myth or the belief that this was not something I could do. And so, James, I just wanted to turn this back to you and say, do you remember what that was like at the time?
I do. And let me just say as well, by way of introduction, it's so nice to see you both, and I miss you both so dearly. It's just lovely to be here with you. I do remember that moment, and there were two things going on in my head. One was I knew that I did not have any idea what you were experiencing internally, and I didn't have any access to that. And I also understood that this blockage of sort of believing that you weren't able to take these two paths simultaneously was something I could see very clearly that it was possible to do this. I had no doubt in my mind that, for example, you wouldn't be fired. It just seemed to be this was going to be an incredibly sort of well, it was going to be a process in any case, but it seemed like a sort of, in a way, like a light switch thing, right? There's something you think you're not able to do, and when you decide, yes, I'm going to do this, and when you know it is possible, it's just sort of a matter of how, it's a planning thing. It's a strategy conversation, and that seemed to that was what I wanted to accomplish in that very brief interval, was to move from the question of, is this something that is possible, to, well, yes, it is something that is possible. So now let's talk strategy. Let's sort of plan, figure out how you're going to do it. But it seemed to me that so much goes into convincing oneself that there are certain parameters to your action, and that it can be very freeing to reframe that as like you can shift those parameters pretty quickly, almost immediately, but you need to know what to do with that energy. And I think it has to go into the planning and into the strategy and into the sort of conceptualizing. Well, now that I've made this decision, how do we move forward? How do I pursue this vision of an alternative?
Thank you, James. Perfect. So talk about implementation, in walks Deborah Becky. So so I knew I had to, as James said, I knew I had to take some steps to do this in a smart way, and in a responsible way. And I had, a wonderful school community that I was part of. And I knew that in order to do this, I needed to communicate with my administrators and give them a heads up. Hey, I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be publishing an article. I'm going to be putting this on my website. I'm going to be speaking in the nearby community. If a student or a parent gets wind of this, or a student brings it up in my classroom, how am I going to handle it? And so I turned to Deborah, the school psychologist at the time, and she and I had worked together over the years. She helped me to bring yoga into the school guidance department. And then when I became a dance therapist, she helped me make a way for me to intern in the schools. So we had many conversations about, clinical work and therapy. And she is just a really smart woman. So I knew she'd know what to do and really help me. So I remember sitting down with her and saying, I'm going to meet with my vice principal and my department head. and then the principal, starting with the vice principal and department head. And I'm going to let them know that I'm a survivor and that I'm stepping into this advocacy work and that I'm going to have impeccable boundaries. And I knew, because I have a therapy background, that it's important for students when they have an English teacher to have me just be the English teacher. If a student says, I'm a survivor too, it's important when I'm in the role as a teacher that I'm not also his or her therapist or their therapist. And so I was going to lay that out for my school administration and let them know how I would navigate that. So Deborah, I asked for your help with that. You helped me come up with a strategy, and then you walked with me in there to do it. And I will tell the world that was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. It's one thing to speak in front of a group of strangers, but to speak in front of a school community that's known me for years, and now they're going to know this happened to me, and are they going to think less of me, and are they going to judge me, and will they not see me as a professional anymore, but it was just a risk I had to take. I had to do it. It felt like jumping off a cliff. And Deborah, I don't know if I could have done it without you walking in there with me. So can you talk about what that was like for you?
Well, I remember feeling very, very moved that you wanted me to be a part of your disclosure, because that's a position of incredible trust. And so I felt very honored. Also, I was frightened for you. I knew those administrators. I had fought the fight with them on many, many issues, and they could be quite intimidating. And so I was thinking, how could I support you but not take your power away? I didn't want to speak for you. That wasn't my job. My job was just to be your safe, I don't know, bubble around you. I had this image. This is a silly thing, but of King Kong batting away the fighter planes as you spoke your truth to the administrators. So it was, and in fact, when we went in, I don't think I said a single word. I don't know if you remember. You spoke your truth with courage, with obviously feeling what you felt. It wasn't that you were a robot. You did it fully. And I saw their eyes begin to connect, begin to understand. And I felt like our baby's grown up. Here she is.
Thank you, Deborah. I think, I remember there being some tears in the room. Like it was.
Yeah, I think so. I started to fill up here again.
And I was so lucky because I just felt met by a wave of love is what I felt. These people that had known me, I felt like one thing that's interesting is when you let people see you, you give them a chance to love you. And in hiding, you don't really give people the honor to know you, and you don't let them support you. And so when I did that, it just felt like a wave of love and a wave of support that I had never let in before. And I know when I walked out of that office, my life would forever be different, because that meant that, the beauty of social media is that, I published my article, but then I could put it out, and that people from my childhood and people that, had grown up with me suddenly knew what I had lived through my whole life. And then they loved me. They like that love came in, and that support, and that never would have happened had I not come out, had I not said, this is what I've lived through my whole life. And there's so much beauty in that. And there's, and so when I think of other survivors, just living their life in silence, there's so much pain in that, because you can't be fully known, you can't fully receive love. You can't fully give love. So I think there's just so much power in that. So that is my story. That's the essence of my story that I'm going to share today. And now I want to use the time to ask some questions for Deborah and James, because they work in public schools, and they work with kids, and they know the prevalence of how kids suffer when they aren't supported and when they're going through really hard things. So I'm going to ask them some questions now. So the first one is about hard conversations. And, I know from working in schools that there are numerous students who do suffer throughout the day because there's not a place for those hard conversations to happen, for students to really feel seen for who they are. And so that it keeps students feeling separate and they feel alone. And maybe, James, you can start off with this one and just talk about what are the ways that you create places and means for students to be heard and to have those hard conversations.
Hmm. If you permit me to sort of meander into an answer, I've had a thread I wanted to follow, which is, I think, putting yourself into the shoes of a young person in school who is carrying something that they don't feel like can be visible, or they don't know how to make visible, can make school a very difficult and uncomfortable and constricting place. And one of the problems, I think, with it is school has its own rhythms. Something, you want to think about it in really simple terms, like the bell rings at the end of the period. It doesn't matter how engrossed you are in a very important interaction, but when the bell rings, you have 4 minutes and you have to get to the next place. And that sense of there being a kind of existing order into which you have to slot yourself, I think, convinces people that they don't have agency. I mean, you sort of feel like you're just along for the ride. And if you've adjusted your life to concealing or otherwise sort of not sharing elements of yourself that are really, really significant, then you associate that state of sort of hiding with that place and with those rhythms. And so part of the problem is, even if you convince somebody, well, okay, you know what, this is you need to be able to be sort of open about this, for your own sake. How you do that is so complicated because you feel in a way sort of bulldozed by just the way that the institution operates. So I think it's really critical to create new spaces, or create spaces that don't feel bound by those rules and conventions. And for me, a lot of that comes through, most of that comes through the arts. So I run a poetry group, and that has been a space over the years that the students and I have sort of cultivated, where you're sort of ripping open a space for something novel and different. And that serves a really critical function, because something that I think is not often understood by young people who are in some kind of a closet or who are carrying something very heavy and difficult, something they don't necessarily realize is it isn't actually just a matter of revealing oneself, right, of coming out. But when you are living a life in a closet, you're not cultivating yourself. You are, as we're not, like, there's sort of aspects of like development that are not happening, right? It's, you don't necessarily, not only can other people not know you, but you can't really know yourself so fully, because you're spending all this time doing the work of concealing. And so part of what I love about poetry and about having this space where students can write whatever they want and perform in all the strangest ways they can think of, and they come up with amazing things, but there's a real creative freedom to it. Part of what they're doing is it's exploratory. They're putting on hats, they're trying things on. I'm going to do a thing like this and see how that works. We've had students do such incredible and I have to say, like, odd, in a really beautiful way, things in this space, because they want to try everything. And in so doing, they get to figure out, well, yeah, this actually feels nice. This clicks. I like this style of reading. I like this kind of piece. And what's even better is they get to master certain sort of things, and then they say, all right, I feel like I can do that. Let me try something else on. Now everyone thinks that I'm the rhyming poet, but I'm going to do a poem where I don't do any kind of rhymes. And now, everyone sort of, and they get to engage in a really dynamic and active way with people's perception of them and then have agency over changing that. And also view themselves as artists as something that is dynamic and alive. And that kind of space, for these reasons, is so critical because it enables people to do that exploration work, but they're physically in the building, right? And then they can go out into their classes and say, oh, well, I've worn all these hats before. I've been able to sort of stretch the way that I am. I feel a greater sense of agency and dynamism, and that carries through into these more conventional spaces where they're then able to sort of stretch out and spread their wings a little bit. So I think it's really critical to create these sort of spaces of exception when it is possible, where that growth work can happen, and then sort of send people back out. Because as much as you can do in the classroom and during a class, I think you are always going to have those limitations that the institution sort of imposes.
Beautiful, James. And I know out of your poetry group, very important conversations come up. So I know that. And now, Deborah, if you would talk a little bit about, this, I love this conversation and the people who are in it because there's such a balance here. And so, Deborah, with the do no harm, that comes from the therapeutic background, would you talk a little bit about like maybe your concern for sexual abuse survivors, and how, what if they start talking in school? So if you can talk a little bit about that.
It's a very complex issue. You want to be able to say, I'm a safe person, I'm someone you can trust and share with. At the same time, you have to be honest about the fact that people in schools are mandatory reporters. So if someone shares a history of abuse or a present abuse or whatever, I have to get on the phone and call an authority. And so one of the first things I would do is when I heard some kind of conversation, maybe you can feel it going down a road, I literally do this, time out, and I want to reiterate, this is my role here in the school. But then it's also my duty and responsibility to provide resources for that student, to accept non-judgmentally, empathically, what they're trying to tell me and say, here is where we can get you some support. So it's a funny kind of tightrope that you walk in a school. You have a tiny bit more leeway in a college, but even still, you have to be honest with students about how much you can keep confidential.
You might hear my cat screaming in the background. But so Deborah, that's very true. And for incest survivors, sometimes disclosing means, and I think about this in my own life, disclosing might mean being removed from your family, and some students might not want that. And I know for me growing up in my family, the arts, I feel like, saved me because it was my place that I could speak my truth and have that, but it was a safe way to do it because I was saying the truth without really saying it. And so those kind of halfway means of speaking, especially in a school, especially in a community, where you're like, someone's seeing me, seeing this aspect of me, but it's not to the degree of really saying what's happening and then having to deal with the ramifications of that, which for survivors, sometimes it's dangerous to tell,
Yes.
So that's why the arts can be so beautiful,
I also found that a great vehicle for providing support for all students who have that mantle of otherness. And I feel like survivors of abuse always feel outside and not a sense of belonging, is group work with adolescents. I love doing it. They love being in it. And you didn't have to say everything. We had some students who never spoke, but they came to group every week, and they listened and they related and they were seen and they belonged somewhere. And so I would encourage that for all survivors. Find a group, go to your guidance department, and is there a girls group I can join? because it's a wonderful support without having to go any farther than you feel comfortable.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful, Deborah. All right, so I'm going to move on to a next question. Well, actually, maybe one more part of this question, Deborah, before I come back to James. How prevalent is childhood sexual abuse in schools?
That we know about. You hear all different numbers. I would say 1 in 4. 1 in 4 girls has probably experienced some type of sexual violence. And I talk about this too, also bringing in teen dating violence. But I think there's more than we have any idea.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the problems that comes up is when someone discloses, people are, not everyone, I shouldn't say that, but some people feel like, oh no, that couldn't be possible. I know them. They would never do that. So it's hard to believe, but it is very prevalent. And I have served as what's called a first complaint, going to court when someone has brought it up in counseling. And I have done that at trials. And it's just a harrowing thing.
Yeah.
But it's there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to add for the numbers, it's probably even more male students because there's that gender bias, they don't disclose, and also non-binary students. So like, the numbers are probably much higher. So it's very prevalent.
Right.
All right. So James, I want to come back to you. You are someone who helped me, helped me have my voice. You helped me claim my voice. You helped me know that I had a right to my voice. And sometimes people in community need to know that it's safe to have your voice. It's safe to be powerful. And sometimes certain issues come up that can be both political and legal. So could you talk a little bit about the ways that you help educate people to know that they have a right to their voice?
It's a big, expansive topic, and I suppose there's a sort of a lot of ways a lot of directions from which to come. But if I could sort of get really, really 30,000-foot view, it seems to me that all of our goal ought to be to live in a properly democratic society, and what that means functionally is that everybody needs to have their voice, and everyone needs to be able to express themselves and their needs, and their dreams and their desires. And the way that I tend to look at that in terms of like helping other people to cultivate it is that, going back to what I was saying about poetry, is it really is a creative act. I sort of I don't think about finding one's voice as, it's in a box somewhere and I'm digging through and there it is, right? I think it's something that we have such a great deal of creative agency over, and our voice can be many different things too, right? So I think it's less a matter to me of well, I suppose perhaps the way that I think about it is inviting people into the creative task of experimenting with self-advocacy and experimenting with having a voice and being an agent in one's own life. And so I think that starts with an acknowledgement that advocacy can look a lot of different ways. It can take a lot of different forms. People can have all different kinds of boundaries, which can shift around, what that looks like and in what sort of sectors of their life they're applying that. And for me personally, as an artist and as an educator, I feel like I've changed a lot over the years in a kind of wild and meandering way, like the kind of like what it means for me to use my voice, or what it means for me to express myself, what it means for me to try and be true to myself, and allowing that flexibility and allowing that to be a creative process makes it fun is the other thing. And I think it is. I think there's something really beautiful about the exploratory work of figuring out what it could look like to be a self-advocate in all these different realms of your life. And so I like to, as I say, invite people into that process. And part of that is through modeling, right? I think a lot of it is through modeling, but I think it also does help to frame things in these creative terms because it feels a little more accessible. I think a lot of people have the unfortunate belief that they just lack the capacity for self-advocacy, or they lack, I don't have a voice really. I'm sort of it's, there's nothing there to find. And I think if you feel like that, I invite you into the creative work of cultivation and discovery, because it's there's a lot out there for everybody, and it's a lifelong process. So the earlier you start, the more sort of interesting things you may find about yourself.
James, I'm going to interrupt you because I have watched you be so courageous on so many occasions, and I've watched you stick your neck out for certain populations and certain kids. And that's it's not easy. I've watched it be very stressful for you and very hard. Can you just give an example of some of the ways that you have advocated for kids in the school, either years ago or today? Can you just give a couple of examples, because I want people to really know this aspect of you?
Yeah, I'll share one. The thing I'm perhaps most proud of, or the thing that I think was maybe most impactful. A number of years ago, we had a quite public incident of racism in the student population, and I helped start a student group called the People of Color Student Union, and who, by the way, whose founding leaders have gone on to do really great things, which is very exciting, and often cite this experiences as formative. A lot of students of color were dealing with the problem of not that they couldn't take, being able to acknowledge certain kinds of problems, but essentially not having any hope that there was an alternative, because they didn't have a strategy, they didn't have a pathway. And a lot of the issue was that, and going back to the subject of hard conversations, there were just a lot of interpersonal interactions that needed to happen, and there just simply wasn't a space for it, right? So we put our heads together and we're trying to figure out, how can you create an environment where young people are able to speak truth to power, but without, the hard thing about speaking truth to power is the power differential. It's hard to be heard if someone has the ability to not listen to you. And so we knew that we needed to engineer a kind of setup where this would actually, you sort of couldn't shut it down. So together we organized this series of meetings where about 20 teachers would be in a room, and we had 4 or 5 students of color who were sort of on a panel. And what happened is the students basically talked to each other about their experiences in the classroom. And the rule was that the teachers weren't allowed to talk. And so the students just talked about their things, and rather than getting hung up, people would get hung up on one thing and they'd want to sort of drill down on that, or sort of deny, or whatever it was, but you couldn't do it. So instead, you just had to listen to these students talk about their lives. And the power of that moment was, you could feel it. It was like the air hardened. It was insane to experience. It was so powerful. And I think the coolest part about it was a lot of these students were young. Some of them were like sophomores, and they weren't particularly they hadn't exactly, like many of them really hadn't done a great amount of work to cultivate their voices, or to sort of be incredibly painstakingly clear about everything all the time. They were, young people just talking, and relieved of the need to be perfect messengers, because that's what we so often want, is these sort of perfect messengers, which a young, no one can be, but least of all a teenager who should not be expected to be a perfect messenger. Relieved of that duty with this sort of structure, their truth was able to come out a lot more clearly. And those conversations were some of the most powerful. And also, I think, if I might use this sort of language, I think a lot of adults in that room were able to skip steps. Like they were able to come to understandings and conclusions that could have taken years, but instead it could take 15 minutes, because they were just forced to confront something which they really didn't want to. I was really proud of that. And it was opportunities to do things like that have been, I think, the best work of my career.
Thank you, James. Awesome. Yeah. I wish everyone could really know you guys. See. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking about, going back to my agenda at the start, what does it mean to be an advocate for survivors as a survivor? I know firsthand what that means is a lot of self-care. There have been seasons where I can speak, and then there have actually been like years that I've had to pull back, and then I can pull out again, and then I can pull back. And it's really challenging if you are an incest survivor, like if this is also your family. So I remember Patrick Kennedy wrote a book called A Common Struggle, and we all know the Kennedy legacy, right? And he wrote about mental health and about addiction and about the truth of his family. And he took a lot of heat for it from his family, and he said, well, my story just happens to also be my family's story, and I have a right to tell my story. And so as an incest survivor, when you are, trying to help other people and advocate for other people and tell your story, there might be things like your family might get mad at you, right? Like your family might not like this. And we have to remember that we always have a right to speak our truth, and that it is not our job to protect those who perpetrated us. It's not our job to protect the anonymity of someone who chose to abuse a small child. They let that go the moment they made that decision to abuse. So, but the family systems that house children that are abused within that system, because it takes a village to abuse a child. It really does, that's a quote from Spotlight, the movie Spotlight. So, a lot of times the family does a lot to protect the perpetrator, and so when survivors go to speak, they can get a lot of heat from the family, which is breaking the number one rule. You don't talk about what happened, so all of that can come up for a survivor. I'm encouraging really my audience, who I assume are also survivors, to try to speak in their own life, to try to live, encouraging them to live their life openly. However, it's a dance, and there are challenges. And so, Deborah, if you could talk a little bit about self-care. I know that you've worked as a psychologist for years. I'm sure you have space for your own supervision, how when you're helping people, maybe stuff from your own life comes up. How do you really make sure you're safe yourself, taking care of yourself, and you don't lose yourself in the process of helping others?
That's a really important issue, I think, for anyone who's in a therapeutic or role of being a support. If you take on everything, if you take it on and you feel it deeply, well, that's a strength, but it's also can kill you. So I think it's important to not confuse empathy with taking it on. And taking care of yourself can be as simple as taking a break between clients or between speaking engagements or whatever. You take a walk in nature, someplace where you feel safe and free. And it's no accident that I'm a yoga teacher now. Yoga is a wonderful form of self-care. And when you think about issues of abuse, you think about disconnection with your body. That happens for so many survivors, and it can carry on to forever. And yoga is a way of safely rediscovering your body and allowing it to be. And I think that's a great way to take some space for yourself. I'm not sure really where else to go with this other than that you cannot be a strong advocate if you have laid yourself open to lots and lots of hurt. You have to be strong. So in a way, you have to step back and maybe disconnect a little bit from your own issues and just listen. I'm not doing this very well.
No, I think you are completely.
It's just reassuring yourself that you don't have to jump in and be in that moment with that survivor to be helpful, that you can take a step back and with empathy and care, you can protect yourself and protect them. So
That's beautiful, Deborah. One thing I want to bring in here with you for a moment is, when you talked about like join a support group, right?
Mhm.
So sometimes when, we're all at different stages in our healing. And sometimes when we come to a group, and sharing the details of what happened to you can be re-traumatizing to other people. So sometimes, the facilitator of a group has to be really skilled and have a lot of good boundaries and hold those boundaries, especially for a group of sexual abuse survivors. I know when I first was coming to terms with my abuse, I had a therapist who said, join a group, but the groups didn't feel safe to me because everyone was disclosing details. And I was like, and so, I would just say like, if you're looking for a group, find one that has a real strong facilitator that can navigate, this is how much we share in this space and that sort of thing so that people are safe. And another piece I just want to add in here is, the second part of my agenda today is talking about the need for there to be a more visible community of survivors. When I was 20 and first was like, oh my God, I'm an incest survivor, knew what that title was and what it meant. I looked around me for examples of leaders and teachers and people in my community that I could see that had lived through what I lived through and were doing a relatively normal life. Like I just needed to see that was possible. And this was way before Me Too. So I didn't see anyone. And that told me that I have to be in silence too. And that was really damaging. So I encourage people, if you are a survivor, if you're able to, if you're a CEO of a company, or if you're a principal of a school, like if you are able to just say like, yeah, I was an alcoholic, or yeah, I was a child, I struggled with this in my life, or yeah, to normalize these things so that people can see like, I'm not the only person living, And what I'm advocating for is not that you have to tell all the details of your story, but just to say, I am an incest survivor and I'm not ashamed of this and it's part of who I am. That simple thing, having more people do that in the community says like, and that's what the Me Too movement did, was it said, me too, me too, me too, and so to have that grow, but do it in a way that feels safe to people, feels good to people. So going back to kind of what you were talking about, Deborah, with self-care and how to navigate, it's so hard to navigate how to feel safe, I love the piece of the body. That's why dance therapy, that's my main thing. But is there a way, Deborah, that how can you identify what's a safe community and what's not a safe community? Are there things to look for? Checks and balances.
Well, I think in a school, the person who's leading the class, the person who's leading a group is always looking out for the safety of the students. And sometimes when you were talking about now I'm going off your question, but your comment, talking about people seeing examples of successful human beings who say, yes, I'm a survivor of incest. That can be a dicey thing in a school, because that may trigger a student who has maybe not disclosed it even to themselves. And then suddenly there's an epiphany, and then you have a very vulnerable child in a classroom. But I do think there's a way, especially when you're a teacher and you're introducing a novel or something, and maybe there's a case of, I'm thinking of The Bluest Eye, which probably most schools don't teach, most high schools. I don't know. Maybe you could tell me. Yeah.
I know we've had it. I don't know anyone who's taught it, but we've had it kicking around our book room.
But for those who don't know, a very important part of the book is incest, is abuse by a daughter from a father. And I think there's a way in introducing something to be able to say, this is a very distressing event. This happens more than we know. People are not inclined to share that information. Sometimes they feel ashamed. But understanding that this was perpetrated upon you, you didn't invite it, you didn't pull it in, you didn't lure it. So a way to do that in a general way, maybe is to help kids feel like, oh yeah, I'm not alone.
Yeah. I think that's true, and I think that happens. And maybe we're not at a place in society where it's okay for teachers to disclose, but maybe just more adults in society, because I think after Me Too, I think it would have been okay for a teacher to say Me Too. Like, I think that wouldn't have been as shocking because it was more normalized, just thinking like, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I have a dream that it can be more normalized. It can be talked about, but you're right. I love, Deborah, that you bring in the part of like, do no harm and have great awareness on how that might be impacting people too. So great. James, is there anything you want to jump in with before I get to my last question? You might have something percolating.
I don't think there's anything in particular. No. Just listening and learning mostly.
Great. Okay, so I guess my last question for you guys is, James, you already hit upon it, but how can we use arts as healing? How can we use the arts to heal ourselves? And you guys could talk about this in your own life. Or you could talk about how you've seen it for others. However you want to take that. How can we use the arts to heal ourselves?
To sort of answer your question by way of reiterating something I said earlier, this might be a useful way to frame this. As people are navigating what it looks like to heal, and navigating what it looks like to be an agent, and navigating what it looks like to be an advocate, it's quite possible that people will run into the problem of like thinking of themselves and their identity in a certain way and then trying to shift it. And there's an interesting conundrum that happens with the arts where a lot of people, and this is not just with young people, I think it's everybody, people get very hung up on the word artist. right? An artist is a practitioner of art, and it feels like a weird label to own. And so I think there's a lot of people who, for whatever reason, feel a kind of exclusivity about that, right? I'm not an artist, so I'm not a practitioner of art. So even if something I'm doing you can call art, you know, for whatever reason, there's a sort of oddness about that. And I think sweeping that away is so critical, because first of all, the arts are for everybody. And second of all, art is, I mean, the arts are a way of living. It's sort of the conscious, effortful, creative application of oneself to a variety of different things, right? I mean, there's so many. You could do anything as an artist. You could be a teacher who approaches teaching as an art, which is, I think, the way I like to think about it. And I think you can approach healing in the same way. Healing is an art. Advocacy is an art. Self-advocacy is an art. And so getting through the weeds of like not of all of the kind of weird pretensions and things that surround that category, I think is a really important first step, and just sort of discarding all of that, and opening oneself up to the arts as a creative means of doing pretty much anything. But to the specific question of how to use the arts to heal, I think it really just comes down to like whatever, it doesn't have to be any particular practice, but I think having an art practice and cultivating one's creativity builds your power. It builds your ownership over yourself. It builds your sense of agency. It oftentimes, because this is inescapable, it also builds community, because our art is a lonely endeavor for some, but I think probably for most, it is a means of connection. So I think in both direct and indirect ways, simply the act of cultivating oneself as an artist is healing, even if it feels like you're you know, these two things are separated. And you know, for some it could be dance, could be music, could be poetry, could be sculpture, could be anything. But taking the time and the space and the capacity to cultivate oneself and cultivate one's art, and whether or not you're concerned with output, none of that stuff matters. You know, just making the space for creative exertion, I think, is like really, really critical.
Beautiful. Great answer, James. Thank you. How about for you, Deborah?
Like, when I think about art, it's a very central part of my being. I'm married to a musician, and I was a theater major when I was a wee girl. And I think particularly about theater, it serves so many purposes in the life of someone who's healing, someone who's on the outside. You can go to a performance of theater, and especially when the themes are universal, suddenly you connect, you say that's my life, that's me, I feel that. And they get me. I can remember being at, it's a silly thing, but watching a chorus line. This was after years of struggle in the theater. And when I first saw a chorus line, sobbing in the chair, that they got what I felt like being rejected constantly. And but this was the love of my life. But then there's the other aspect of theater. It can help you transcend your current state. If you feel depressed, isolated, lonely, anxious, sometimes you go to the theater and it just takes you to another world, and you feel calm and good. And then there's the other thing of sometimes for the person without a voice, you take on a role, and it's a role, so it's okay. And you speak, and people listen because they're in the audience and they paid money. But that ability to speak through another vessel can be very, very empowering. So that's what I say about theater and how important that can be.
Beautiful. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of, dance therapy has its roots in indigenous practices. And shamanic practices, and everyone dances, as James said, and everyone sings, it's part of us. And if we don't have it, and we're like limping, right? And so, and it's fun, right?
And it's fun. It's fun too.
So you guys, I so appreciate you coming today. I think I have a cat spirit guide, because you're going to hear him meowing. It's like downstairs, like, oh, I want to be part. But I feel like today that the conversation maybe isn't over. That we've opened up a conversation, and my heart's cry is to make things better for someone else living the path that I lived. To just make it easier, that they have more resources, that they don't have to go in hiding, even though I did. And I know that everyone in this call, every speaker here, we are advocates for kids. We care about kids, and kids having their voice, and people believing their voices. And I just think that's, so important. And so having your experience and the years of work that you both have done in the lives of children. And, James, we didn't get around to it as much. Maybe I'll bring you back another day, but like, you've done so much in terms of like political activism, and so much on like the legal front, like I appreciate the work that you have both done in the lives of kids, and in the lives of changing communities and making the world a better place. So, thank you for being here. And I just feel like there might be another conversation down the road 7 years from now, who knows. Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye. We'll say goodbye to the audience, and then you guys hang on and I'll say goodbye to you. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.